Most people who have been involved with a narcissist believe that change can only happen if the other person has an awakening, apologizes, or at least acknowledges what they have done. But the deeper and more painful truth is this: that system is not sustained by their change, but by your participation. You did not just love them. You were pursuing an illusion built from moments that felt intensely real, the feeling of being seen, of being connected, of being mirrored, as if someone finally understood you. And because of that, you stayed longer than you should have, hoped longer than was safe, and gave more than any human being should ever have to sacrifice. Then one day, not because you became stronger, and not because you were fully healed, but because something inside you grew too exhausted to keep chasing anymore. You did not abandon them. You did not punish them. You simply stopped propping up a structure that was never able to stand on its own. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. Not because you won, but because you withdrew. Not because they lost you, but because they lost the mirror that once allowed them to believe their illusion was real. This video is not about what the narcissist will do next, nor does it promise a dramatic ending or loud retribution. It is a story about a deeper shift, a shift that occurs when the empath stops chasing someone else's illusion and, for the first time, turns back toward themselves. And from that moment on, it is not just the relationship that changes. The entire psychological structure on both sides begins to fracture. And to truly understand why everything begins to shift the moment you stop chasing, we have to return to a more fundamental question. Not what the narcissist did to you, but what you were actually pursuing in that relationship. Because if you only look at the surface, people will say you loved too much, sacrificed too much, or clung to someone who was not worthy. But the truth is not that simple. An empath does not stay only because of love, nor do they become exhausted only because of pain. They stay because they are drawn into an extremely subtle illusion, one built from moments that felt like the most authentic experiences of their emotional life. What you were pursuing was never just a person standing in front of you. It was a feeling, a state, a version of yourself that existed when you were with them, a place where you felt more deeply seen, more intensely connected, and believed that something very rare was happening. The narcissist did not create that illusion out of nothing. They observed you, listened to you, reflected back your most beautiful, deepest, and most vulnerable parts, then gave them a form that made you believe you had finally met the right person. And once that illusion took shape, you did not simply love, you invested your identity, your sense of meaning, and your belief in life into it. Here is where the problem lies. What you called love was actually built on an asymmetrical structure. The narcissist does not enter a relationship to meet a whole human being. They enter to find a mirror, a place that reflects back the image they want to believe is real, powerful, special, admired, and free from having to face the emptiness within. And you, with your deep capacity for empathy, unconsciously take on that role. You do not just see them, you hold for them the parts they cannot hold for themselves. Insecurity, anger, emptiness, and the fear of being exposed as having nothing beneath the surface. This is the illusion the empath was pursuing. Not the illusion of a perfect relationship, but the illusion that if you were patient enough, understanding enough, loving enough, the real person behind the mask would stay. You believed you were not just loving someone, you were accompanying them through the process of becoming themselves. And it is precisely that belief that keeps you explaining, keeps you waiting, keeps you questioning what you did wrong each time everything falls apart. Because if that illusion were real, then the collapse must somehow be your fault. But the hardest truth to accept is this: that illusion was never built to last. It existed to be pursued. It lived on your energy, your presence, and your ability to keep believing even when every sign pointed in the opposite direction. And so the moment you stop chasing, not through anger, Not through retaliation, but through quiet withdrawal, is the moment that illusion begins to collapse. Not because the narcissist changes, but because you are no longer there to sustain it. In the next part, we will go deeper into the real reason empaths continue to pursue this illusion for so long, not because of weakness, but because of a very deep unconscious mechanism where compassion, personal shadow, and the need for recognition merge in a dangerous way. Empaths do not continue pursuing a narcissist because they fail to see the problem. In fact, they are often the first to sense the misalignment, the contradictions, the subtle feeling that something isn't right from very early on. But what keeps them there does not operate on the level of reason. It lies in a much deeper unconscious mechanism where empathy, personal identity, and their own unexamined shadow intersect. For an empath, love is not just attachment. Love is attention, presence, the ability to read what is unspoken. They are wired to feel what others do not feel safe enough to feel for themselves. And when they encounter a narcissist, a person built around avoiding their own inner world, those two psychological structures lock together in an almost perfect fit. One refuses to look into the inner void. The other has the ability to see it, touch it, and try to hold it for them. What keeps the empath chasing is not blind hope, but meaning. They do not stay only because of what the relationship provides, but because of the role they are living within it, the role of the one who understands more deeply, endures more patiently, matures more fully. The role of the one who believes that if they withdraw, the other will collapse. And at a deeper level, that role gives them a powerful feeling, I matter. Not in the sense of being praised, but in the sense of being needed where someone else is helpless. This is where the empath's shadow begins to emerge, not a shadow of malice, but the shadow of the rescuer. A part of the unconscious that believes, if I am good enough, deep enough, persistent enough, I can reach the part of them they have never faced. This shadow does not come from control, but from the fear of losing meaning if no one needs you at that level anymore. And so every time the narcissist grows cold, withdraws, or breaks the connection, the empath does not only hurt from losing love, they hurt because their role is being threatened. This mechanism drives them to keep explaining on the other's behalf, to keep finding reasons for behavior that cannot be justified, to keep waiting for an awakening moment that was never actually designed to happen. The narcissist does not need healing to survive in that relationship. They only need you to keep believing. And every time you return, try to understand a little more, give a little more ground. You unintentionally reinforce the illusion that this relationship has depth, when in reality it only has repetition. The most painful part is that empaths often realize all of this very late, because they confuse intuition with responsibility. They sense the other person's emptiness and unconsciously make it their job. But the truth is this: you did not chase them because you failed to see reality. You chased because you tied your identity to keeping that illusion alive. And as long as you believe your presence is what prevents the other from collapsing, you will keep running, not after them, but after your own role in that story. And that is why the moment an empath stops chasing is never an impulsive decision. It happens when they no longer recognize themselves through the rescuer role. When they begin to feel that continuing to be present is no longer love, but self-erasure. From that moment on, a very different kind of withdrawal begins to take shape, not leaving the relationship, but withdrawing energy from the illusion that sustained it from the very beginning. The day an empath stops does not arrive as a clear decision. There is no declaration, no ultimatum, no dramatic confidence often attached to the idea of letting go. In reality, it feels more like a very deep exhaustion, so deep that you no longer want to prove anything. You no longer want to be understood. You no longer want to be recognized as right. You no longer want to keep this story meaningful. You still see them. You still understand them. But something has changed. You no longer feel compelled to do something with what you see. That moment is often mistaken for numbness. but it is not emotional shutdown. It is the moment when emotions no longer pull you forward. You realize that every time you explain, every time you wait, every time you hope they will see what is obvious, you are not really loving, you are maintaining a structure in which your presence is a necessary condition for the illusion to exist. And what makes you stop is not that they did something wrong one more time, but that you see clearly. No matter what they do next, you no longer want to remain in this role. Empaths stop chasing when they no longer need answers. Not because every question has been resolved, but because those questions no longer hold power over them. They stop searching for the final moment, the final conversation, the final apology, the final acknowledgement, because they understand that any ending dependent on a narcissist's recognition is an unfinished ending. And they no longer want to spend another day waiting to be validated that their pain was real. This withdrawal is very difficult to see from the outside. You may still be silent, you may still be polite, you may even still remember. But inside, a thread has snapped. You no longer react from the rescuer instinct. You are no longer pulled back by the confusion between love and responsibility. For the first time, you allow yourself not to understand further, and that brings a strange, almost frightening relief. Because when you stop chasing, you also stop being the center of someone else's emotional world. This is the moment the empath begins to reclaim projection and turn it inward. What you once saw in them, their uniqueness, their hidden depth, their unnamed pain, gradually reveals itself as parts you had placed onto them through your own capacity to perceive. Not to blame yourself, but to realize this: much of what you thought was us actually came from you. And when you no longer place those parts onto the other person, the illusion loses its most essential adhesive. For this very reason, this shift is quiet, but it is irreversible. You may feel nostalgic, but you no longer want to return. You may feel sadness, but you are no longer willing to trade yourself to preserve a connection that only ever existed because you turned yourself into a mirror. And from that moment on, a new order begins to form first within you, and then gradually across the entire relational structure. After the empath stops, the first thing that changes is not emotion, but inner orientation. The sadness is still there, the memories are still there. There are even days when you remember vividly every intimate moment, every look that once made you believe the bond was real. But there is one crucial difference. Those emotions no longer govern your behavior. They pass through you rather than pulling you back. Silence begins to carry a different quality. Before, silence meant waiting, hoping the other person would speak, filling a tense gap where you tried to read every signal to decide what to do next. Now, silence no longer has a task. It does not ask you to understand, to fix, or to rescue. It simply becomes a space where you begin to hear yourself again, sometimes clearly, sometimes uncomfortably, but truthfully. Something very subtle happens. You are no longer compelled to be seen as right. The narcissist's distortions of the story, their casting you as the villain, or their continued life inside their own version of the truth, these things gradually lose their weight. Not because you suddenly find them acceptable, but because you no longer need them to be witnesses to your experience. Your pain does not require their validation to exist, and your truth is no longer dependent on whether they are willing to look at it. At a deeper level, power begins to return in a very quiet way. Not the power to control others, but the power of no longer being pulled out of yourself. You realize how much energy you once spent just to keep the relationship from collapsing: attention, emotional energy, self-questioning. When you stop chasing, all that energy does not disappear. It returns. And at first, that is not comfortable. Because when there is no one left to focus on, you are forced to face yourself. This is the phase where empaths often confuse recovery with emptiness. There are no longer emotional highs, no more drama, no familiar push-pull cycles. Instead, there is a long, quiet stretch where you must relearn how to exist without being needed at an extreme level. Many people panic at this stage and go back not because they love, but because they are unfamiliar with life without the old role. But if you stay long enough in that quiet, something essential begins to form, an identity not built on sacrifice. You begin to feel boundaries not as walls, but as an inner axis. You no longer need to explain excessively because you no longer doubt your intuition. You no longer need constant defense because you are no longer living under evaluation. And for the first time in a very long time, you can be alone without feeling that you are abandoning someone. This is not radiant happiness. This is a very quiet steadiness. It is precisely in this state that the empath stops being the mirror. Not because they become cold, but because they no longer reflect in order to keep someone else from collapsing. They begin to reserve their energy for what can respond, rather than for structures that exist only through depletion. And when this happens, a parallel shift begins to unfold on the other side, not immediately, but inevitably. When the empath stops, the change within the narcissist does not occur in the way many people expect. It rarely appears right away as panic, apology, or visible collapse. On the surface, they may seem fine. At times, they may even appear relieved, as if finally freed from a relationship that was too emotional. But that is only the final layer of a structure losing its most essential support, the reflecting mirror. The narcissist does not operate from a stable inner center. They exist by constantly adjusting their self-image through others' reactions. When the empath was still there, still explaining, still hurting, still reacting, still trying to understand the narcissist, still had data to maintain the illusion of power, value, and influence. But when that feedback disappears, it is not just the loss of a relationship. It is the loss of their ego regulation system. At first, this creates a state that is difficult to name, not quite sadness, not yet fear. It feels like an internal misalignment. Familiar behaviors no longer produce familiar results. Signals that once drew the other person back, silence, coldness, ambiguity, even pain, now fall into a void. And it is precisely this absence of response that begins to erode the sense of control that forms the foundation of the narcissist's existence. At a deeper level, a very discrete form of panic emerges. Not panic over losing you, but over losing your role within their system. When you no longer reflect, they are forced to see themselves more than they can tolerate. And because they lack the capacity to be alone with their inner world without external stimulation, they will attempt to fill the gap through other people, activity, new stories, or rewriting the past. But all of these efforts share one common trait. They are driven by absence, not by free choice. This is when indirect reactions begin to appear, not always obvious hoovering, sometimes vague signals, accidental encounters, stories meant for you to hear. The goal is not to return through love, but to test. Does the mirror still work? And when there is no response, that unnamed insecurity gradually turns into fixation, a form of obsession rooted not in longing, but in loss of access. What is important to understand is this. The narcissist does not necessarily miss you in the emotional way you once missed them. What they cannot tolerate is a reality in which you no longer occupy a central role in their structure. You are no longer the place where they offload what they cannot hold, nor the surface that confirms they still have impact. And it is precisely this quiet withdrawal that destabilizes the deepest foundation, not because of what you do to them, but because of what you no longer do for them. This shift rarely ends in a climax. It stretches out, simmers, and repeats. The narcissist may continue living, continue performing, continue constructing new images. But from the moment the old mirror disappears without an equivalent replacement, a crack forms. Not a moral crack, but a structural one where power based on reflection begins to fail. What many people misunderstand most about the empath's silence is that they assume it is avoidance, fear, or a form of passive retaliation. But the deeper truth is this: non-participation is not a reaction, it is a withdrawal of power. And for a psychological structure that lives on reaction, nothing is more dangerous than you no longer stepping onto the stage. The narcissist does not control through direct action. They control by pulling others into an emotional loop where every response, whether love, anger, explanation, or defense, provides proof that they still have influence. When you argue, they win. When you explain, they still win. Even when you suffer and question, you are confirming that they remain the center of your emotional reference system, and that is why your participation is the fuel. When the empath no longer participates, this entire logic begins to collapse. Not because the narcissist is punished, but because their system no longer has data to operate, no reactions to read, no emotions to regulate, no movement to manipulate. Silence, at this point, is neither moral nor strategic in the usual sense. It is simply a state: I am no longer here to sustain this structure. The key point is this: non-participation is not an attempt to appear cold. It is not suppression. It is the natural result of having withdrawn your identity from the game. You no longer need right or wrong. You no longer need to be understood. You no longer need them to confirm that what you experienced was real. And when that need disappears, every door to manipulation closes on its own, because manipulation only exists when there is something to pull. At a deeper level, non-participation is the moment power returns to its proper place. Power does not lie in making someone else collapse, but in no longer being pulled out of your own center. You are not trying to stay calm. You are calm because there is nothing left to activate. You are not pretending to be indifferent. You are indifferent because the game no longer has meaning. And this creates a very different kind of freedom. Freedom from having to react in order to exist. For the narcissist, this state is unmanageable because they are not built to face someone who does not reflect, does not react, does not participate, yet also does not disappear in a way they can control. You still exist, but out of reach. And that is the greatest paradox. You do nothing, yet the old power structure can no longer function. Non-participation is not the final step. It is the breaking point. From here, the relationship is no longer the center. The narcissist is no longer the axis. And the empath begins to enter a different phase, not merely recovery, but a repositioning of self in the world, where they are no longer a mirror for anyone living on illusion. In the next section, we will move to the final shift, the moment the empath fully exits the mirror role, and what that truly means for their inner maturation. There is a shift that occurs only after the empath has truly stopped participating, and it is so subtle that many people do not recognize it right away. This is when you not only withdraw from the relationship, but withdraw from the mirror role that once defined you in many previous connections. Not only with the narcissist, but with familiar structures where you existed by understanding more, yielding more, and stabilizing others. At this stage, the empath no longer asks, "Why did they do that?" Or, "If I had been different, what would have happened?" Not because those questions lack answers, but because they are no longer central to your inner life. You begin to look back at yourself not with judgment, but with a level of honesty you had not previously allowed. You see clearly that you once tied your self-worth to endurance, patience, and becoming a place where others could unload without accountability. And it is here that identity begins to be restructured. You no longer feel better by sacrificing a little more. You no longer feel more valuable by being the one who understands the most in the room. You no longer confuse emotional depth with self-erasure. This does not make you closed off. On the contrary, it gives your empathy boundaries. You still feel deeply, but you no longer allow that depth to pull you into structures where it is used only to sustain someone else's illusion. This change produces a strange sensation. You are no longer drawn to connections that are overwhelmingly intense from the start. Grand promises, fated bonds, rapid familiarity, these now cause you to slow down rather than rush in. Not because you are afraid, but because you no longer need intensity to feel alive. You begin to choose consistency over gaucho, clarity over mystery, reciprocity over one-sided hope. This is the moment the empath truly exits the narcissist's gravitational field, even if they have not been present in your life for a long time. You no longer define yourself by who needs you, who misses you, or who is affected by your silence. These things become secondary not because you deny them, but because you now have an inner center strong enough to not require constant external reflection. And most importantly, you no longer need that relationship to fully collapse for you to be free. You do not need them to realize anything. You do not need them to pay a price. You do not need them to understand who you once were in their life, because the true ending does not occur on their side. It occurs on yours, when you no longer carry the old structure into how you love, how you attach, and how you show up. From this moment on, the empath is no longer a mirror for someone else's illusion. They become a person with their own inner axis, capable of loving without turning themselves into a place where others escape from themselves. And when that happens, the old relationship, no matter how deep it once was, no longer has the power to define you. It becomes part of the journey, not a sentence, not an identity. The next and final part is not to close the narcissist story, but to name what has truly occurred. When you stop chasing someone else's illusion, it is not only the relationship that shifts the entirety of your inner life, moves into a new order. When the empath stops chasing the illusion of a narcissist, what ends is not a relationship, but an old inner order, an order in which you once existed by reflecting, enduring, and stabilizing structures that could not stand on their own. This change does not require a climax, nor validation from anyone. It happens quietly, but completely like a river changing course, forcing everything downstream to reorganize. Many people wait for the narcissist to collapse, regret, or realize what they lost. But that is not the ending of this story, because if you still need that to happen in order to feel free, then at some level, you are still standing in their gravitational field. True freedom begins when your attention is no longer directed at what they will do next, but returns to the only remaining question: how will I live when I am no longer playing the role of a mirror for anyone? The greatest shift does not lie in leaving, but in no longer carrying the relationship into how you love, how you attach, and how you understand your own value. You do not need to resolve every question. You do not need to rewrite the story correctly. You do not need to prove that you once loved deeply enough. Those things once mattered, but they are no longer necessary for the new order you are entering. When the empath stops, the illusion is no longer sustained. Not because it is destroyed, but because no one believes in it or maintains it anymore. And in the space left behind by that illusion, something else begins to form. An identity that does not require reflection to exist. A capacity to love without self-erasure. A presence not defined by how much someone else needs you. If you are in this phase where everything feels quiet, undramatic, yet deep inside there is a clear sense that you can never return to your old self, you are not lost. You are shifting your axis. And not everyone reaches that point. Because the moment an empath stops chasing someone else's illusion, they do not become cold, they become free. And from that point on, not everything becomes easier, but everything finally becomes real. When an empath stops chasing the illusion of a narcissist, what truly ends is not the relationship, but a role, the role of the mirror, the role of the one who stabilizes what cannot stand on its own, the role of the one who stays long enough to hope that if they understand more, endure more, love more, then the truth will finally appear. But the truth is this, that illusion was never created to become truth. It existed to be sustained, and you were the source that sustained it. The greatest shift is not in your leaving, nor in whether the other person realizes anything. It lies in the moment you no longer carry that relationship inside the structure of your inner life. You no longer love in a way that erases you. You no longer attach by sacrificing clarity. You no longer confuse emotional depth with remaining inside a system that drains you. And from that moment on, you do not need a dramatic ending to be free, because freedom has already happened from within. Many people wait for the narcissist's collapse as a form of justice. But the real justice in this story is not on their side. It lies in the fact that you no longer need them to collapse in order for you to live truthfully. When you no longer need their story to validate your worth, power returns to its rightful place, not the power to control, but the power to be fully present in your own life. When the empath stops, the illusion is not destroyed, it dissolves on its own, because there is no longer anyone maintaining it. And in the space left behind by that illusion, a new order forms, one in which you no longer exist as a function in someone else's life, but as a person with an inner axis of your own, with boundaries, with the capacity to love without bargaining away the self. If you are in this stage where everything is no longer loud, no longer dramatic, but you know with absolute clarity that you cannot return to your old self, then that is not a loss. That is a shift of axis. And not everyone makes it there. Because the moment an empath stops chasing someone else's illusion, they do not become cold, they become real. And from then on, every connection that enters their life is either real or it no longer has a place to exist.